Hi. So today we are going to do an adult portrait watercolor. So we'll learn sort of the proportions of the adult face, which you might have known already. We'll go over that fairly quickly, like 10-15 minutes. And then we'll start playing around with skin tone. We're going to be drawing a black woman. My best friend Erica gave me permission to paint her today. So we'll focus on a darker skin tone. And she has braids in her hair in this portrait. So I'll sort of show you sort of the quick way that I do braids, just so that you don't spend hours and hours and hours on hair, because we want the focus to be on the face. So let me switch to my paper. So this is Erica, the lovely, beautiful Erica. I'm going to sort of have her right off to the side the entire time, so that we always remember to look back at our reference photo while we're painting and drawing, because we want to get, one, the proportions correct. Getting the likeness of a portrait it's very complicated, and it takes much more than just an introductory photo to how to create the correct skin tone. So we're not going to focus on the likeness per se today, but we do want to focus on getting those proportions right, and then we'll play around with light source and shadows and all that. So for the face shape, I just sort of start very, very lightly sketching an oblong oval. That's going to be the sort of the shape of her face. And she's not looking directly, or she's looking at the camera, but her face is sort of off center. So instead of drawing a straight line right through the middle to get a sense of sort of the axis of her, or the diameter of her face, we're going to do sort of a curved line from top to bottom, and we'll follow that curve when we're placing our facial features in there. We also want to create, since she's looking, this is what we call a 3/4 view, so we'll be able to see a little bit more of this side of her face than this side. So we do want to create some depth here. So this will sort of be the back of her skull back here. And then we'll have a neck that comes down off of the back there. Not paying too much attention to the neck right now, but just placing it so that it's not just a floating head. Okay, so this sort of bottom of the oval we did there, we don't necessarily need those lines. That line might confuse us when we're putting our facial features down, so I'm just going to erase that. And then we can go straight into the eye line, which you can eyeball this, but basically right smack in the middle, that's going to be the line where our eyes go. And then we have to divide this line into the bottom of the chin, divide that into 3 equal spaces. You can do this by eye, or you can measure it if you want. These are just general guidelines. Maybe the person you're drawing has different proportions, but these are just sort of the general guidelines. Okay. So we have our midpoint here, so that's exactly where the bridge of the nose is going to go. So I'm going to block out sort of where my eyes are going to begin. Since we can see more of this side of the face, this eye is going to be further from the center line, and then this eye is going to be a little bit closer. So that's why I have about 1/4 inch here versus 1/2 inch on this side. And that means the actual width of our eyes are going to be slightly different here as well. So I'm going to start drawing the shape of my eye. I did sort of an overarching arch, and then you bring one down just a little bit to show sort of that top eyelid. And then her eye's gonna come back down and up to that little tear duct. And then over here, this eye is gonna be a little bit wider since we can see all of it. So again, I'm gonna show it a little indication of the eyelid, the tear duct area, and it comes up, and then comes back down and up to that corner. So since she's sort of looking, she's not looking up or down, she's looking straight ahead. We don't see any of her nostrils. So that's gonna make things a little bit easier for us. We don't have to figure out nostrils. But we do want sort of the edge of her nose. Generally, the edge of your nose is right where those tear ducts are. But since she's at a 3/4 view, that is going to change just a teeny bit. So I'm going to draw these two lines coming straight down, and that will be sort of the boundaries of the nose. So I'm going to draw this sort of slightly curved line of her nose. Again, it's not going to be quite symmetrical since we can see more of this side of the nose than this side. So there we go. And then we can, there's not really a sharp line here, but when we get into painting and we have a highlight and a midtone and a shadow, we can show sort of the depth of the nose. But as far as a pencil line, we don't really need one right there right now. She has a little sort of furrowed brow right in the middle here, so we're going to leave that. And then her eyebrows don't really have a curve to them, so we're going to come back and reinforce these with watercolor. But for right now, I just want to get a sense of where they are. Okay, and then we come down here to the lips. I guess first we'll draw in the pupil, because we'll need to know where her pupils are to sort of help us measure where her mouth will go. So there we have the iris and the pupil. Make sure that iris is sort of getting cut off by your upper and lower lids. If you can see the white of the eye around the pupil, it's going to give much more of an expression, like a surprised or scared expression, when you want to sort of match the expression of your photo reference. Okay, so just like we drew lines coming down to where the edges of the nose are, same thing, but coming down from right in the middle of those pupils. You can come straight down. And that is where the edges of the mouth will go in between these two lines. So what I like to do with the mouth first is just get the shape of the entire mouth. So that is the line from the top of the top lip around to the corners of the mouth all the way down to the bottom of the bottom lip. I want to get that shape right first. And then we can sort of fill in the thickness of the lips and then the teeth in there. So we're going to come down maybe 1/2 inch from the bottom of that nose. Again, it depends on who you're drawing right now as to the sort of height of that space between the nose and the lip. But generally, there's a little dip in the shape of the top lip right under sort of the middle of the nose there in between the nostrils. So I'm going to draw that shape in. And then, so Erica's smiling here, but the corners of her mouth don't go that far up. It's just pretty much straight across. So just really pay attention to the direction your lips are going in here. But then the lips really come down to show off her her bottom lip. And again, since we're not looking at these lips straight on, the shape is not going to be quite symmetrical. Okay, so that's sort of the general shape of the lips. Now I'm going to go in here with each individual lip. So her lip sort of comes down from the corner and dips down quite a bit, and then comes back up a little, like this. And then you have to figure out sort of the thickness of the lip here. So it comes down. And then comes back up and then meets the top lip. All right, and I would even say the bottom lip is a little bit thicker, so I'm going to make this line go further down just a tiny bit. Okay, and then the tricky part with teeth is you don't want to draw every single tooth, or else it'll start to look a little creepy. So what we're going to do here is just show that sort of scalloped edge of the bottom of the teeth. That way we absolutely know that there's teeth in there, but we don't need to see every single shape. Like that. Okay, so those are our major facial features. So I'm going to erase all the lines that sort of helped us or guided us into where those facial features needed to go, but some of them we don't need anymore. So we can just erase those out because we don't want those showing up underneath all our watercolor. And I'm going to fill these eyes in just a little bit. Just because, like I said, with the teeth and not looking creepy, the iris is not being filled in makes it feel a little creepy. Okay, so that's less creepy. Okay, so now what we can do is really focus on the shape of this outer edge of her face and the chin. And then we'll get to the hair. So what we want to do now is really pay attention to all the different sort of curves and angles along the side of her face. I sort of like to start right by the eye, since that's sort of the part of, it gets closest over here, so I can sort of judge how much space is between the very edge of her eye and then the edge of her face, and then I can judge everything else based on that. So I'm going to draw up past the eyebrow and then up into the forehead. So there's not much of a curve, at least right by the eye, but then it curves up and around for the forehead. And then because she's smiling a little bit, her cheeks sort of bounce up a little bit more had she not been smiling. So we're going to have a little curve, and I'm just going to try to pay attention to, if I lay a straight line across, where does that curve begin and end? So it sort of begins sort of right here at the edge, or sort of between the eyes and the bottom of the nose. That's where it starts. And then it sort of comes back in right below the nose. And then we have another curve along the jawline. And then her chin sort of comes around and then comes back up. Sort of the angle of her jaw sort of starts to change right as we move past her face, or sorry, past her mouth. So we'll have that angle change. Okay, so then since going back to her smile, she has some sort of creases in her cheek where that smile is coming out. So we'll draw those in. And these lines are going to be really important when we start doing the shadows, because your cheekbones always cast a little bit of a shadow. And then I'm going to go back to the eyes. I'm going to draw in sort of this lower lid. Since eyes are very three-dimensional objects, these lids have to cover basically a circle, or sorry, not a circle, a whole sphere in your skull. In doing that, it's going to cast some shadows since the eye is that three-dimensional object. And then we have a little bit of wrinkles. Everybody has some eye wrinkles when you're smiling. So I just want to draw those in. Okay. So that, and then we have some more lines up here in the upper lid that we want to draw in. Okay. So then the hair. With the braids that she has, we're going to just paint in the braids. We don't necessarily need to draw every single sort of twist and turn of those braids. But I do want to get the overall shape. So I'm going to draw first just sort of the shape of her hair. And then we can come in and draw some more sort of the major strands of her braids that we'll paint in with some shadows and some texture. Again, this is different from if you were painting Caucasian hair, but we're taking a similar approach to it, where with Caucasian hair, you don't paint every single strand of that hair. You just get a general sense of the flow of it. So that's what we're doing right now. We're getting a general sense of the flow of these braids. But then when it comes to actually painting the braids, I'll show you that technique. It's sort of if you think about a basket wave technique, that's similar to what we'll do here. Because you want there to be texture. There's not a lot of highlight in her hair. Like the camera is not picking up on any of the texture that's in here, but there is. But it's very subtle. And when it comes to painting it, there'll be a couple of layers, and then we'll glaze on top of that so that there's not a lot of contrast. But we will be able to see some texture back here. Let's see, and then we have some showing from this side of the face, not much. My reference photo also has her wearing a seatbelt. Safety first, but we don't want that in our portrait, so I just have to imagine where some of this hair is coming from. So I'm just going to have a couple strands on this side. So that we can sort of show off what those braids will look like when they do have a light source on them. So I'm just going to remind everybody where my light source is based on my reference photo. I'm going to draw a little light bulb up here. And I'm going to always keep that in mind especially when I start painting. Okay. So at this stage, just look back at your reference photo and your drawing, see if you want to make any changes. I actually think I want to change the shape of her jawline. I think her her chin is a little bit more pronounced than I had it. And then her jawline, so that makes her jawline a little bit more dramatic. All right. So yeah, just take a moment before we start mixing up any paint to make sure that you're satisfied. Again, we're not focusing on the likeness right now. What we're focusing on today is just how to create a dark skin tone, and then how to play around with lights and shadows, and then texture when you don't want that texture to be very contrasty. We'll create that texture, and then we're going to glaze on top of it. So that's what we're focusing on today. I'm going to draw a little bit of sort of the muscles of her neck, and then probably just to show that she's wearing something and that she's not just a floating head here. I'm going to draw some shoulders. There we go. Okay, so before we get to the actual skin tone, what I like to do is mix up a shadow color. And then I'm going to come in with the underpainting of exactly where I think all my shadows need to go. And then in doing that, you don't really have to worry about your shadows anymore because they're already there. And then you can just layer with multiple layers of skin tone to build up sort of the richness of this color. So what I'm going to do here is create a shadow color it's still based on her skin tone, but we're not necessarily painting her skin tone just yet. So I have some burnt umber. That is going to be the base of our color for a dark skinned person, is burnt umber. And then we can add a little bit of either alizarin crimson or cadmium red, or whatever red you have, just to like warm that color up a little bit, warm that brown up. And then the last color is just going to be a touch of either ultramarine blue or cobalt, just to make that brown darker. It's still a very warm brown because of that red we put in there. So that's another thing when thinking about skin tones. Always make sure it feels warm. So it has a reddish tint or an orange tint or a yellow tint. When we're painting realistic human beings, we want red to sort of be a common, or warmth to be a common color in our color palette. Because you're portraying a person that's living and breathing and has blood flowing underneath their skin and all that. So just make sure all your skin tones feel warm. Again, that's when you're painting realistically. If you're painting fantasy or painting from your imagination and you want to paint a blue person or being or human, feel free. But for realism here, make sure that all of your skin tones edge warm, more warm than cool. Okay, so I have my color mixed. I'm going to just paint directly onto dry paper because I want to feel like I'm in full control of where my shadows are going. So I'm not pre-wetting anything just yet. And these shadows are going to seem a little intense when you first start putting them on there. It might be darker than the actual shadows that Erica has in her face or whoever you're painting. But again, those shadows are going to be layered on top of, so they'll get the contrast between the pure white of the paper and the shadows is going to lessen based on the rest of the skin tone we use. There can also be an opportunity to sort of blur the lines of these shadows once they're put down, because Erica here doesn't really have a lot of sharp shadows with sharp edges. So we'll go back and blur those edges a little bit. But don't worry if this color feels a little bit more intense than you want. There's always going to be an opportunity to fix that. So I'm going to start up here in the forehead. I feel like this little bit of hair casts a little bit of a shadow that comes down to the eyebrow. So I'm going to fill that in. And I'm going to extend the shadow color into the hair once I get a good feeling for the shadow in the face, because I want the face and the hair to have similar colors. I don't want to feel like the hair's just sort of pasted on top. And I'm going to move over here, sort of the bridge of the nose here sort of creates a shadow under the eyebrow. And then this side of the nose has some shadow, but then the nostril has a little bit of a highlight. So I'm going to leave parts of that nostril with the white of the paper. The nose always casts a little bit of a shadow if the light source is above your portrait or the person you're painting. So what I'm doing now is just creating sort of that outer edge of where the shadow of this side of the face starts, and then I'll fill everything in. The little creases of her smile have some shadow. There's a little bit of a shadow underneath her bottom lip. And then a shadow on the chin, which sort of lightens up the more we get back to the jawline. So what I'm going to do here, there seems to be a couple of places where things get lighter, right? Like right here on the jawline and then right here on the cheekbone. So I'm going to paint around those areas and sort of leave those two areas the white of the paper, so that they always, no matter how many layers I put on top, they won't be as dark as this sort of shadow around them. What I'm doing now is I sort of rinsed my paintbrush, and now I'm coming in with just clear water to sort of move those shadow colors around. I'm going to leave sort of the top edge of this lower lid. I'm going to leave that white because that is a bit lighter. Erica here is also wearing eyeliner. We'll address that later. But the top of the eyelid has a little bit of a highlight, so I'm going to leave that alone. And then the rest of the face is in shadow. Okay, I'm going to come in with clear water and just sort of fill in these two spaces that are a little bit lighter than the full intensity of this shadow color. And they're just a tiny bit lighter. It's not the white of the paper, but it's also not as intense as some parts of the face. So I'm going to come in with clear water and I'm going to sort of blur the edge of this shadow on the forehead, just so that there's an easier transition between this shadow color and the mid-tone that we're going to put down next. Erica has sort of a little indent in her forehead here, so I'm going to paint that in. I'm also going to do the same along the edge of the nose so that the shadow will blend a little bit easier with a mid-tone color. And do that on the bottom of the nose. The very bottom of the nose will be in a little bit of shadow as well. Okay, So now we get to the lips. The top lip is going to mostly be in shadow. Just because when you look at the lips on like a profile view, like by the side of the lips, the plane of that top lip sort of faces down, whereas the plane of the bottom lip faces up. So we're going to have quite a bit of a highlight on the bottom lip here. So I'm going to leave a big chunk of that bottom lip the white of the paper so that I can always come back in and make a highlight here. The lip's going to have several layers though, just because she's Erica here is wearing lipstick, so the lips will have many layers. Okay, so even on the side of the face that's in highlight, there's definitely still some shadows on this side though. So I'm going to go in with this top lid, always casts a little bit of a shadow onto the eye. So I'm going to do that on both sides. And I'm going to go ahead and fill in the pupils here. Always leaving a really bright white highlight right in the middle of that pupil just to show, you know, some life in the eye. In the eyes. So just always leave some highlights there. You can go back with just white paint to reinforce those. We'll probably do that at the end of this. Okay, and then that lower lid will cast a shadow onto the cheeks. Again, we have some tiny little wrinkles here from smiling. We can place those in. Right under the eyebrow is going to cast a shadow. This upper lid, this crease is going to be dark just because there's not a lot of room to cast a shadow, but there is a teeny one there. And then the cheek, the bottom of the cheek here is going to have a little bit of shadow since the highlight is going to be up here. Okay, so that's the shadows on the highlight side of the face. So I'm going to come in, at least I think the cheek really is the only one where I really want it to blend. The shadows on the eyes you can sort of leave alone. Those shadows are usually pretty small and distinct, so they don't need to blend into anything really. Okay. And then I'm going to blend the chin one a little bit as well. Okay. So that's the face. I'm going to put a little bit more pigment up here just so that it feels even. Okay. So another thing we need to do with this color is generally if your light source is above your subject matter, the head is going to be casting a shadow onto the neck. So I'm just going to go ahead, and obviously this depends on exactly where your light source is, but I'm going to go ahead and fill in the majority of her neck here with that shadow, just so that all the highlights on the face will really convince the viewer that that neck is sort of receding into the background. And in doing that, I'm also going to extend this shadow color into the hair so that it all feels connected. Again, we're going to come into this hair with a lot more detail and texture once we get a layer of skin tone down on the face. We're gonna focus on the hair while the face is drying. So let's just get a layer of the shadow down, and then we can go back to the face. And one of the things I tend to do with hair when I'm doing a portrait is I don't focus that much on the hair. I want the focus to be on the face. So you'll see once we start doing the texture in here that it's pretty quick. It's not very detailed. It's not going to pull attention away from the face at all. But it's still going to be representative, I think, of the kind of braids she has in her hair. Okay. So I sort of drew a line here, basically so I could stay on camera. But this is basically going to be the end of the portrait. So if you want to have some of this sort of extending past that, just so that you don't have empty space down there. Or if not, you don't have to. Bring these down a touch. Okay. Okay, so now that we have our shadow color down, now we need to really focus on her actual skin tone or whoever you're painting today. So her skin is definitely, I'm still gonna start with burnt umber, but I think I'm gonna have a lot more red than I do in my shadow color, just to warm, because she's got such a warm, like caramelly face, that I want it to be a lot warmer than the shadow color. And what you can do, I'm working on a sheet of paper where I have like a bunch of excess, here, let me show you. I have excess paper that I'm not working with. So what you can do down here is sort of test your skin tones to make sure, because obviously the skin tone changes based on, what colors are being reflected, what atmosphere your portrait or your model is in. Like her jawline is reading a little bit more pink, I think mostly because she has this big pink necklace on that's reflecting that color. So down here, I'm just going to create some swatches. Where I'll create sort of my base skin tone, but then I can have little examples of what if I added a little bit more red to that skin tone, what if I added a little bit more yellow, just so that I have a color palette of all the different skin colors that I plan on using on my portrait here. So what I have here, what I'm mixing right now is burnt umber and either cadmium red or Grumbacher red, whichever like red you have that like reads pure red. It's not purple or orange. It just feels very red. So burnt umber, a pure red color, and then a little bit of yellow. That's sort of what I'm starting with. And again, I'm going to make a little test down here. And that's when you can sort of pull your photo reference down here to make sure it's close, or if you need to adjust it a little bit more. I think I maybe want to try it. So this is that same color, but just diluted a little bit. And then you can wait for these to dry before you move forward. I'm not going to wait just because I want to give you a completed image in like an hour or so. So here I'm adding a little bit more yellow. So this sort of more yellow or orange color I'm going to use on the side of her face with the highlight. And then maybe this original skin tone, that's what I'll use to overlay on top of all this shadow, plus extend it a little bit more so that I can create a mid-tone before I get to the highlights. So I'm going to bring that back down. So I feel like I'm in this area where I like the original color I created, but I need to dilute it a little bit more before I put it on her face. Okay, so I feel good about that color. I'm going to start again right back up in the forehead where I started before. I start there just so that I can change quickly if I feel like I need to. The forehead is easily changed. Once you start getting down here, it's harder to change things up that quickly. So you can sort of see that color, how it acts on top of pure white paper, and then when you're glazing on top of the shadows you've already created, that creates a whole different color. Again, because we're trying to use a skin tone that's very warm, so putting that on top of that shadow color should warm it up even more. So right now I'm just overlapping exactly what I did with the shadows, but sort of in an even coat. And then you can see the areas that I left just a little bit lighter, like the cheek and the jawline here. They're still lighter because everything is getting this sort of layer of skin tone. You can also, once you put color down and you feel like you want to dilute it just a little bit more, just clean your brush and just add clear water directly to your paper here. So what I'm going to start to do is really try to blend this color as a gradient and get it almost to the edge of where that highlight is going to be. And then sort of just leave the very edge white. I'm going to do the same thing under the eye. And then leave, since this highlight on the side of her face is pretty strong, I want to leave the white of the paper. Also this edge of the nose, I'm going to leave the white of the paper just so that we can make sure that the tip of the nose has a little bit of a highlight. I'm going to come down to the lip. So now I'm getting into mid-tone range where I'm filling in the values of the face that I hadn't already filled in with the shadows. And I'm going to come down to the neck, make sure the neck gets this same skin tone. And for some parts of the face, you might feel comfortable enough to just cover anything you had left white. Cover it with the skin tone, and that creates just enough of a highlight sort of that highlight within shadow, because everything in a shadow isn't always as dark as possible. There's always something that's just a little bit lighter than what's around it. So I'm going to do that with like the eyelids. I feel like I had left just enough white space on those eyelids to now they can just get the skin tone, and that skin tone looks light enough against those shadows that it seems like it's a little bit of a highlight. And always go in with clear water if you feel like things are getting too intense. If adding clear water just makes your color sort of puddle up too much and you don't want all that excess water, just use a tissue, go in and pick up those colors. Okay, so that's sort of layer one of our skin tone. I'm going to paint a little bit more over here, and then we can start playing around with the hair while all this is drying. I do want to put a little bit of that skin tone on her lips, just so that her lips start to warm up some. Again, these lips are going to get a coat of like red as well because my model here is wearing lipstick, but I want to make sure that this skin tone is sort of evenly distributed. And then we can layer on top of this with more color. I'm also leaving a little bit of highlight around the chin. Again, that's going to help the chin pop up and the neck feel like it's in the background. All right. So what we can play around with now is the hair. So I'm going to create a pretty dark, but not pure black. So I'm going to start with my burnt umber. Again, burnt umber is sort of just our base for everything and for a dark colored person. I'm going to add a little bit of my Grumbacher red or cadmium red. A little bit more burnt umber, and then a lot of ultramarine blue. That's what's going to make this dark tone feel pretty different from the skin tone, because it's not going to have that sort of warm feeling to it. It's going to just read a little bit more neutral dark tone. Okay. So the way I do this, there's many layers involved here, but the first layer is just sort of creating that braided texture. So I'm trying to go along with sort of the flow of the braid here, but just like laces of a shoe or laces on like a baseball, we're just sort of come in and make these sort of stripes that don't go all the way across the width of the braid, because we're going to come in with an opposite stroke. And when I say this a little bit like basket weaving, it's because you want these brush strokes to feel like they're interlocking a little bit. So for every stroke you made going down that first time, just make sure that each one of those strokes has another stroke sort of running into it. And this may take some time, but again, doing braids this way, as opposed to really looking at every single movement in the photograph, this is just going to take a lot less time. So I'm going to do this on a couple because as you can tell, there's a lot of white space showing through, which is not necessarily something you want in your finished product, mainly because it's going to take focus away from the face. So after we get this texture into each braid, then we're just going to glaze over it with this same color, just so that the contrast sort of falls away, and you can still see the texture, but it's not as in your face. And then, of course, you're going to have braids that are overlapping each other. Just make sure that you're doing enough of this texture to really fill in the spaces. And then any space that you don't get filled in, we'll at least get the coats of this same color once we start glazing. So if you miss some spots, that's fine. And always make sure you're sort of moving with the flow of the braid. The direction of these marks are going to change based on the curve of the braid. And then once we get to the braids that are sort of near the back of the head, you can either stop making this texture and then it'll just get the glaze of this color, or you can keep doing the texture. Depends on you. But this is sort of a little therapeutic part of the portrait. While you're waiting for something else to dry, you can put more detail into other areas. Make sure I get some on this side. Because this side is sort of half in highlight, I'm really only going to be creating this texture on the shadow side of these braids, maybe just a little bit in the highlight side. But when things are in highlight, it blows out some of the detail a little bit. So these braids here probably are not going to have sort of the full treatment like the ones over here. Okay, I'm going to do a couple more over here. Since we have a little bit of a highlight on the top here, I'm not going to put this texture up there. Okay. So again, on camera, you can see how much white space is still up there. While all that texture dries, we're going to go back to the face, do another layer of skin tone while that dries. So it's just a back and forth. We glaze this area, we work on this. We wait for that to dry, we work on this. Then we'll glaze that, and then we'll come back to the face. Okay, so we have the skin tone that we used for the first layer. Now would be sort of where I really look back at your reference photo to see if the color's correct. If not, the next layer you put down could be slightly different from that first layer. I'm going to add some yellow just to lighten it up just a tiny bit. And then this is what I'm going to do my next layer with this color. Okay, so I'm going to start with, maybe areas of shadow that I think need a little bit more attention. So like this part of the cheek on this side, I feel like needs to be a little bit darker and a little bit bigger. And then it'll extend up to the eye. Because again, since we're working with a dark-skinned model, even where the highlights are, the highlights aren't going to be the pure white paper. So what I'm going to start to do now is with this new color I created that edges a little bit more yellow than red, I'm going to start filling in those spaces that I had left the pure white of the paper. Because highlights on a dark-skinned person are still a color. They're not pure white. And then I'm going to use this same color just as another layer on what I've already done, just to make the overall color just a little bit richer. Again, because you put down that first layer of shadow, you're still not going to lose any of those parts of the skin tone that may be lighter than the shadows. But you can just see already, well, at least in person, this is starting to feel like a lot smoother now that I'm adding this third layer. Essentially with watercolor, the more water you introduce to paint that's already sort of dried, it's going to loosen up that paint just a little bit, and that's where that sort of smoother color comes, or smoother texture comes from. And then I'm going to bring this color all the way up to the top of the forehead. Put some of this color in the neck, not all of it. I do want the color of the neck to be a little bit different, depending on your model and maybe how much foundation they put on or not. The face could technically be a different color from the neck. But for right now, I'm going to fill in sort of what I had. Like this side of the neck might get some of the light from our light source, so I wanted to leave that white, and now it's getting this sort of last layer of color. Where it still feels like a highlight, even though you just washed color over it. Okay, so her skin tone, at least in person, is feeling like it's down the right path. But as you can see now, there are places where we sort of lost the shadow or the intensity of the shadows that we had before. So we're going to wait for this layer of skin tone to dry, and then we'll come back with shadows to reinforce all the little creases around the eyes. We're going to bring the eyebrows back. This hair is casting a little bit more of a shadow than it is currently, so we'll handle all that once this dries. What we can do while we're waiting for the skin tone to dry is address the color of her lips. So I have sort of a very, very dark red, which it's Grumbacher red mixed with some burnt umber. I'm just going to sort of lay a layer of this down on the lips. And if it starts to bleed a little bit because of the skin tone you just put down, then you can just wait. You can do this later. I'm still going to leave a little white on the bottom lip. What that does is any reflection on the lips just shows how, shiny or the lipstick that you're using is, or the eyes also get really intense white highlights, as you can see in here. Anything on the face that has moisture to it usually gets really strong white highlights. So that bottom lip, if you're wearing lip gloss or lipstick, and those eyes that'll be sort of the finishing touch on everything. And also in this case, since we have a smiling model, the teeth will stay, parts of the teeth will stay as bright as they are right now. I'm also going to come in, Erica here has really dark brown eyes. I am going to fill in the iris with not as dark as her real eyes are, because I still want there to be a clear difference between the pupil and the iris. But at least get those filled in at this stage, because they might need some more detail later on. Okay, I'm also going to put a little bit of a color on her shirt, just so that way it'll make it feel like it's not just a floating head on our piece of paper. So I'm just going to pick a color that's not in the rest of our portrait here. I'm going to get like a purple. And I'm not going to detail this much at all. But what I do want to do is leave just sort of a jagged sort of edge near the shoulder. So that way it can feel like this shoulder has a strong highlight on it. This side probably doesn't have a highlight on it, so I'm just going to paint sort of the exact shape of her shoulder. And then we'll also address the background. We'll put a little bit of a background color once we work with the hair a little bit more. Okay, so I'm going back to the exact same color I used for all the texture in the hair. I'm going to mix a little bit more just so that I don't run out. Again, that was burnt umber, Grumbacher red or cadmium red, and a little bit of cobalt. or ultramarine blue. Okay, so this is the color I'm going to glaze with, just so that we lose a lot of this white area, but we still get the texture that we put down initially. And I'm still painting like one braid at a time. I feel like if you just wash over the entire head instead of doing a more intentional glazing, that might mess with sort of the feel of the braids. It might feel a little bit more frizzy maybe. So just paint along the same lines as what you have already. And, you know, if this wasn't completely dry before you started painting it, that's fine. Some of the braid details might become a little bit fuzzy. But again, since we want our focus on the face, I think maybe losing some of the detail on the braids is sort of a good thing right now. So you can already see what a huge difference that makes. All the white space up here that gets a little bit distracting, to more of an even, still textured, but just darker area. Since not a lot of these braids, you know, in our reference photo, none of these braids have a lot of highlight on them. I'm going to do the same on this side, but again, I still want maybe half of those braids to feel like they're in highlight. And they're being washed out by the light a little bit. So maybe we would only see a little bit of detail on the highlight side. Okay, so we're waiting for our skin tone to dry just a little bit. And because I don't have my papers taped down, but just on the top and the bottom, so you can see my papers moving around a little bit more than it should. Okay, so I've been using a number 6 paintbrush this whole time. I'm going to move to a number 0. When you want to start doing details around the eyes, like eyelashes and stuff, you got to find the smallest paintbrush you have. So that's what we're going to do. I still have some color left from the hair. So I'm going to use this color for going back into the face and reinforcing some shadow. And this is what's really going to make this come to life once she has her eyebrows back, and once we reinforce some shadows around the eye, it's going to look really great. So I'm going to come in on this eyebrow. And sort of make that reappear. I'm going to come in on this side and do the same thing. Again, my face isn't completely dry yet. But for some of these details, that's fine. Like once we get into the eye, we'll want our face to be a little bit more drier. So while I wait for the eyes to get a little bit drier, I'm going to come in again with this color from the hair, but I want this color to sort of bleed into the skin a little bit, just to show that this hair, even though our light source isn't over here, this hair is still casting a little bit of shadow onto her face, onto her cheekbone. So again, this is also helping the hair feel like it's not just plastered on top of her face, but if there's a little bit of a shadow here, that'll make it feel like it's part of the portrait. I'm going to do the same here in the neck. There's a little bit more shadow. Okay, so you can see how putting in those eyebrows has really helped already. Okay, so when it comes to eyelashes, I've learned that it's sort of best to just put like 3 or 4 eyelashes on the very edge of the eye instead of having eyelashes all the way across. Just because the eyelashes can get pretty distracting. So there we just have a couple of them. And then depending on your model, Erica here has eyeliner going along that bottom eyelid. We're going to put that in. Same thing on this other eye. Strong dark line across the top is her eyeliner. And then just a couple of lashes right at the end to just show that she has eyelashes, but they're not taking over. Same thing on the bottom. Just a couple of lashes on the bottom corner. Same over here. And then these lower lids will have a little bit more of a precise shadow since they're so close to the object that they're casting a shadow on. That one might be a little bit too dark. If things get a little bit too dark, you can always come in with clear water and blend that color in a little bit. I'm also going to come in under her nose and make a little bit more of a sharper, clearer shadow of that nose, casting a shadow. We can also do the same with sort of the creases of her cheek where she's smiling. Those shadows got a little bit lost in all the layers of skin tone, so we can bring that back. Same thing on this side. And then we come back to the teeth. I'm going to use that same shadow color that we were using on the hair and just sort of reinforce the shape of the bottom of the teeth. And then our top lip here is going to cast a little bit of a shadow onto the teeth themselves, so that really, at least in this portrait, those 4 front teeth, those are the only teeth that remain the like white of the paper. And then with this small little brush, I'm going to go in with the red lipstick and sort of decrease the size of that highlight. We're going to come back in with white and make a little bit more highlights. That'll be the last thing we do. Okay, and then we can just reinforce the sort of crease of the top eyelids. Okay. So one thing we can do while a little bit of that face is drying again before we go in with really bright highlights is create a background. We're just laying a color down. Nothing too specific. I'm actually going to pre-wet the paper just so that it blends in. So I'm just going to, on this side, just pre-wet the paper. My clear water is not so clear anymore just because of all the painting we've done already, but that's quite all right. Also, if you don't want a background color back here, that's perfectly fine. I just wanted to show people that you can still add a background once your portrait's already basically finished. You just have to be careful not to drip any color onto what you've already painted. And also sometimes a background color will just reinforce the shape of what you're doing, especially if you do have these sort of really strong highlights where you don't really see the edge or the boundary of her shirt. Having a background color will sort of help establish those boundaries without having to paint them directly. So here I'm picking a green just because there's no green in the portrait itself. So I want a color that will sort of offset all the warm colors that we have in her face. So having a bit of a cool background will just help, little complementary colors. I'm going to use that same color to sort of help reinforce where the highlights sort of stop on this side of the face. And commonly when you have, a color in the background, that color might creep into the portrait itself just because it's reflecting. A portrait reflects the colors that are surrounding it. So once you establish what your background color is and you want to interject some of this green into the face, you can do that. It would probably show up in the shadows a little bit. And I can show you, I can do that real quick after I finish the background. So you can take this background color, sort of drop it into the braids of the hair a little, or you can drop it into sort of the shadow of the neck. And it's not going to be the exact same color just because you're now putting this color on top of an area that already has like 4 layers of color. But it'll be just enough for you to relate that this color is the same color as the background. And sometimes doing this with your shadows will create an interesting contrast just because you have greenish shadows instead of just your old natural normal brown shadows. But again, you don't want to make your shadows so cool as far as your colors are going that your portrait starts to feel like their skin is dead or decaying. So if you want to put colors into your shadow, great, but just keep it to a minimum, and just be careful of how your flesh starts to feel a little too cold. All right, so that is sort of the last thing we need to do. Is I'm going to go back to my size 0 paintbrush, and I want to get pure white. I'm using tube watercolors, so it's already wet. If you're using pan colors, the kind of watercolor that you need to get wet before you can start using, just drop a little bit of water into your white, just to pick up a tiny bit of white on your paintbrush. And what I'm going to do is just sort of reinforce the white spots in our eyes here. So she has like 3 little dots, one that sort of overlaps both the iris and the pupil, one right in the middle of the pupil, one sort of off center in the pupil, and then one long one that sort of overlaps the pupil and then the white of the eye. So that's going to show you that, so these white highlights show you that there's moisture. That white signifies the moisture and the light that moisture is reflecting. So a couple other places that need that white highlight could be this sort of, if your model is wearing a lip gloss of some sort, there could be sort of highlights right along the top lip, and certainly along the bottom lip here. I like to have a bright white spot, a couple of them right on the nose. That will sort of show that the nose is the closest thing to the viewer, and that those white spots just make things jump out a little bit. We can also have some white spots sort of in the tear duct here. Again, there's moisture, so that moisture would be reflecting some light. You can also go into like the hair and create sort of a more textured highlight like that. That sort of disappears into the background. And that's mostly, your teeth are already the white of the paper, so I would leave that alone. So that is, I guess one more thing I didn't touch on is the white of the eyes. A lot of times the white of the eyes aren't exactly white. They're more gray or bluish. So I'm going to make a really, really diluted sort of gray-blue color. And I'm going to come in and make sure that those white of the eyes aren't as bright as the white of the paper. And you can leave a little bit. Like I have a little corner here that's staying super white. But since this eye is farther away from us, we want that white of the eye to recede a little bit. So I'm putting in my bluish gray color there. And then the corners of the eye, since they're sort of wrapping around that eyeball, the corners of the eye tend to get a little bit more shadow than what's in front. Okay, so that is our adult watercolor tutorial, painting an adult with dark skin and braids.